Hi, everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations. Good to see so many people here today. It's very nice. I want to remind you of our schedule. You can also go to lowercolumbia.edu/conversations for our full schedule. But next week we have Marie Boisvert. Oh man, I need to figure that out before next week. Who's going to be discussing choosing and using names across cultures. So please join us again. If you were interested in our February 10th event, we have rescheduled that. That is now going to be on March 10th. So we had to cancel last week, but we're pushing it out towards next week. And also keep an eye on the schedule because I will be announcing the spring series pretty soon. I think that's as specific as I can get about that right now. But anyway, spring series will be announced pretty soon. So today, I'm very happy to have Ian King with us. Ian King is the faculty librarian and has his Master's of Library and Information Sciences from Wayne State University, and recently earned his second master's degree in adult education from Portland State University. At LCC, he is known as the guru of open educational resources and is the liaison for the BAS Teacher Education Program. So please welcome Ian King.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm Ian King. Those of you in the back know me. I was in your class recently. I am the librarian, one of the librarians. And I came to this because I have an interest in educational psychology, cognitive science, the kind of the things that make us behave the way that we do, make us say and choose the things we do. But I am not a scientist, nor am I a psychologist. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, knowing that I do not have that deep academic background in those topics. We do have some amazing psychology instructors on campus that I'm sure would love to tell you how wrong I am in some areas and maybe expound on some of the others. I wanted to start out with this image. It's something we commonly see in social media, right? Whether it's Facebook or TikTok or Twitter, Reddit, any of the social media sites, and even in our personal discussions and arguments with friends, family, and coworkers, and those we interact with. And that's usually, we have all these studies, right? There's always studies. Doesn't matter what you're looking into. There's some study. But a lot of times we pick and choose. We choose, that one study that supports us. And we tend to kind of ignore all the others. And today I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to help change the narrative of this idea of research, right? So the topic research, how you're doing it wrong. I want to change that narrative of what research is and what we view it as. And I just want to remind everyone that research isn't just hopping on Google and doing a quick search. It's so much more than that. And the way we tend to view research today leads to misinformation. It leads to just not realizing the depth of what's out there. So today we're gonna talk about these four topics. So first, we're gonna examine what research is, or what we perceive research to be in our daily lives. And I'm going to be doing that through the frame of this phrase, do your own research. It's something that we hear pretty regularly now, whether it's on social media or in personal discourse. You hear it a lot around politically charged topics. You also hear it, and where I'm going to be talking about it is from the perspective of Wall Street bets and cryptocurrency. Then we'll briefly talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect and what it is, which is, it's a cognitive bias that causes us to overestimate our abilities. We'll talk a little bit about how it's possible that it doesn't really exist, and kind of look into that a little bit. And then we'll talk about this idea of motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. These are two other biases that help us to minimize what's called cognitive dissonance, and we'll discuss that a little bit as well. And then lastly, we'll explore what research really is, what it is traditionally defined as, and how it's so much different than what we really consider it to be. But first, I want to talk about timeline of social media history. I grew up pre-internet, though when I was in high school, we did finally get it. And think about the fact that 30 years ago, that was the first 2 million computers were hooked up to the internet. So my family was connected about 1998 as I was finishing up my junior year of high school. And that was through my dad's employer. He worked at a paper mill in St. Helens, just up the river. And his employer provided, I want to say all the employees, but again, this was 30-ish years ago, so I could be wrong. They gave all these all their employees computers with internet access. But so 12 years after that, so in 2005, Reddit was launched. And the thing with Reddit, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Reddit. Today, it's a big thing, right? Pretty popular for just about everything. But in 2005, nobody really knew about it. In fact, in order to make it look like more people used Reddit, they actually inflated the user base with hundreds, if not thousands, of fake accounts. In fact, they've admitted this since. But they wanted it to look like more people were using Reddit to encourage others to join. In 2006, Twitter was launched on March 21st. The first tweet was sent. And then 6 months after that, on September 26th, Facebook made their membership public. Until then, it was by invitation only. And actually, by 2006, they already had about 1 million users. And then in 2012, Facebook finally reached 1 billion users, Twitter 100 million, and Reddit had about 46 million active users. So the reason I wanted to cover like this brief social media history is to help us to realize that in this short span of 16 years, look at where we've gone with social media, with public discourse, with the way we interact with each other. 16 years ago, how many of us really had, social media accounts or even knew what Facebook was? And so that's really changed the way we view and consume information. For those of us that are of a slightly older generation, we may remember either our parents telling us, or if we're a little bit older than that, we may remember telling our children this, that not to believe everything you read on the internet. That's still applicable today. But as these two social media posts show, in the one, your parents, in 2020, your parents believing every post they see on Facebook. And in 2016, this poster writes, freedomeagle.facebook says Hillary invented AIDS. And sadly, that's kind of the direction our culture has gone in terms of information. We've gone from this, don't believe everything you read on the internet, to friends, family members, everybody kind of accepting what's now being posted. So I want to look at this idea of research as we view it now. And I want to do it, like I said, around this framework, or this lens of the phrase, do your own research. How many of you guys have actually heard somebody utter that phrase, or you've seen it somewhere? It's become fairly common, especially in politically charged discussions around COVID, the vaccine, the masks, personal rights, things like that. But today I want to look at it more through the lens of cryptocurrency and investing, just so we can avoid some of that divide. So in January of last year, there's an interesting phenomenon that began on Reddit, and it started from a subreddit called Wall Street Bets. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. And on Wall Street Bets, they began encouraging their their not their investors, their fellow Redditors, as a Reddit person is called. They're called a Redditor. They began encouraging their fellow Redditors to invest in GameStop or AMC, which is a theater company, because they wanted to pump these stocks up because people were trying to make money off those companies kind of crashing. And the reason that came to my attention is because I've always been, like I mentioned earlier, I've always been kind of fascinated about, the way our mind works and the way, we're influenced by things. And every time I'd hop onto the subreddit and look at posts about GameStop, which I do not own any stocks in GameStop. I will neither tell you to buy them or not to buy them. But I kept seeing this phrase repeated over and over of do your own research or do your due diligence, which is a related phrase. And I began to wonder, do they understand what that phrase means, what that phrase implies? Because the way we communicate information, there's always, a subconscious message in there as well. And essentially what these creators are doing, who we can probably safely assume that they're not financial experts. They're not ones that have gone through, classes on finance and understand, the way the stock market works and all that. So they're telling them to buy, this stock, buy stock in GameStop, buy stock in AMC, or if you go onto a cryptocurrency subreddit, buy Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of those. But they're telling them, do your research, read the financial documents, understand for yourself if this is a good idea. And that, you might wonder, why is that a bad thing? Why shouldn't we encourage people to, do their own research and to, look into those things? And I would be a horrible librarian if I, told you not to do that, right? Like, why am I saying that this is probably not a good thing? And this is where we start to get into that trouble of not understanding what research is. So the narrative of do your own research relies on a couple things, and it can be weaponized. I don't know if you realize, how easily it is to weaponize the phrase do your own research. And basically, one of the narratives says that anybody with internet access and a high school reading level can do this, right? I mean, research is, typing into Google and looking something up and, having, knowledge of said topic. But it doesn't allow that person to really understand what goes into it. Take your average student, for example. There have been a number of studies that have repeatedly shown that the average high school, college student is actually not that great at research. In fact, they're actually not that great at using Google itself. One study of academic librarians in 2017 estimated that fewer than 1 in 3 college students know how to perform basic college level research. Another study, an Australian study, just to show that this isn't just an American thing, an Australian study in 2016 showed that most teachers, because their students have grown up with Google, their so-called, digital children, most teachers just assume that their students know how to use Google. And so they teach to them as if they know what they're doing. And the students in turn, come to believe that they know what they're doing and don't ask for help. And then an Israeli study from 2019 showed that a lot of these students, once they're actually talked to about their research habits and their abilities, responded that they felt unable to process all the information, right? When you do a Google search, there's so many pages. I mean, you could write, type in the most inane thing and get billions of pages. And so students have come out and said, you know what? I don't know how to process all this information. I don't know how to do it thoroughly. I don't know how to do it efficiently. I just kind of find what works for me. And that, a lot of that goes back to, how often do we move past the first page of a Google search? How often do we put in that extra effort to maybe, rephrase what we're searching? Those of you that had classes with me know that I encourage that, I encourage, putting in that extra effort because, traditionally research is messy and it takes a lot of work. But students tend to not realize that. Also, you'll notice I have up here a Pacific tree octopus. there have been more than one and probably more than 5 studies looking at this one website. It's a satirical website saying save the Pacific tree octopus of the Olympic Peninsula. And it's a study, or it's a website useful to determining how well somebody is able to evaluate information. And the sad thing that happens is a lot of times students cannot distinguish the fact that there's no such thing as a Pacific tree octopus. They come to believe, by reading the website and doing some simple Googling, that the Pacific tree octopus, an octopus that lives in trees on the Olympic Peninsula, not in the ocean, is real and it needs to be saved. And there have been more than 2 studies, and we're talking thousands of students that have gone through these studies, saying, yeah, the Pacific tree octopus needs to be saved. We need to, he needs to be added to the endangered species list. We need to take care of it, not realizing that it's satire, that it's fake. There's no such thing. So what happens with the phrase "do your own research" is it kind of covers up a lot of missing context. And context is something I'll kind of come back to repeatedly. But it covers up the fact that we lack expertise in certain areas. For instance, I would never say, okay, you know what? I'm going to plan a mission to space. And I'm gonna figure out how I'm gonna get from here to Mars. I'm gonna plan that mission. I'm gonna execute it, and I'll be waving it at you guys from Mars. None of us would say that. None of us would admit that we know how to plan a mission to Mars, or that we know how to design an airplane. When I first went to college, I wanted to be an airplane designer, and when I failed physics and I got a D in calculus, I realized, you know what? I'm never going to design an airplane, which is sad to me. I love the aircrafts. But none of us would come out and say, I can do these things. But when somebody says, hey, I have this really great stock idea you should buy, our first thought is, well, let me Google it. Let me look up this stock. Let me look up, how it's doing. And so in some areas, we don't realize we lack expertise and a required tool set. We also don't realize that we don't understand what research traditionally is. For instance, if you were to pull up an article on Alzheimer's, and from a mainstream media source, say CNN, Fox, MSNBC, New York Times, any one of those, you pull up a study about Alzheimer's, and you read that study, and it says, if you do this, you'll avoid having Alzheimer's disease. What's your first thought? Is it, oh, I need to do that? Or is your first thought, well, what's the basis of the study? How many people did they use? What was their control methods? What was their research? What did they use to support these arguments? Has it been peer reviewed? Who peer reviewed it? What journal did it come from? How many of us think to do that? Because most of us probably don't, except for Chris. He's raising his hand in the back. So we become these armchair quarterbacks, or these armchair coaches. Like, I, for one, I'm a huge sports fan. I love watching, basketball, football, not so much baseball. But I love screaming at the TV, yelling at the quarterback, saying, why did you throw it to that guy? He was obviously covered. There's no way he was going to catch that. Or, yelling at the ref, like, why did you call that foul? There was no foul there, questioning coaches' motives. And that's kind of the same thing we do here. When we read these studies that are, summarized in popular news, we question not, the academic rigor or the scientific rigor of the study itself, but we don't even think to question, is this right? So do your own research makes us fall in for 3 assumptions. You know what you're looking at, so you understand the data, you understand the documents, you understand what the experts are saying. We know what we're looking for, so we know what data we need, what information is missing. We know how reliable it is. And then you know where to find pertinent information. So you know what searches to try, what keywords, what topics. So what happens, as Brian Fogarty says here, do your own research inoculates the speaker from any responsibility for people's decisions. It also makes listeners feel empowered as if they are in charge of their own fate, and this strengthens an emotional bond with the speaker. So it does make us feel empowered. It does give us that sense of accomplishment that yes, I can look up these topics. I can, plan a mission to Mars. I can design an airplane. It gives us that empowerment, that makes us feel like we're, better at something than we might be. And as we'll get into a little bit later, those emotional bonds are really important for helping us to feel like we are capable of doing something. So what is do your own research really? For one, it's avoiding the burden of proof. When somebody says, hey, you should buy this stock, it's going to triple your investment. But if you don't believe me, do your own research. What it's doing is it's shifting the burden of proof from the speaker to you. Instead of saying, hey, I don't know like how reliable this is, but I feel like if we bought this stock, our investment would go up. It's saying, I know that this is a fact, and if you don't believe me, you got to prove it. And it's making you do all the work to say, no, this isn't real. It's also misleading. Like I mentioned, it encourages us to believe that we have the required expertise, the required tool set, the time to do all the research to say if it's true or if it's not. And then lastly, do your own research heavily relies on cherry picking. Like we opened with that graph. It relies on that narrative that, hey, this is all you need to know that this is true. Don't look at anything else because that's all misleading. Rely on only these things and you'll realize, yeah, you're right, this is true. So it really wants us to cherry pick that information. It's often manipulated in some way. As any of you that have worked with data in any format knows, it's really easy to kind of massage things, right? And make it look like, the data is saying one thing when really it's not. And it's really easy to kind of pass that information off. It's like, hey, just look at this data. It's right. And again, it goes back to that loss of context. When you cherry pick data and when you cherry pick your argument, you strip out all that context that is necessary to make an accurate statement. And again, the cherry picking goes back to what we'll talk about in a minute: motivated reasoning, confirmation bias. A lot of times it's willful. Your friend might not realize that the websites they're passing on to you are trying to get you to think one way, but those websites know, they're in it for the money. Come on, there we go. So here's a couple examples. I pulled these straight off of Reddit. They are cropped and everything, but they are accurate screenshots. I can give you the links later if you don't believe me. But notice how both of these in the very beginning, say this is a disclaimer, please do your own research. I'm biased due to holding Microvision shares. But they're telling you, this is what I think. And then they're asking you to do your own research. So they're already telling you, believe me, but if you don't, you're gonna have to double check this. As a side note, this first one, talking about the MVIS, that's Microvision. It's a company that develops LiDAR, not that anybody really is worried about that. He's saying, hey, there's this earnings call and I think, the stock is going to go through the roof and I own shares and I really encourage you to as well. And luckily, since this was pulled from about a year ago, I went back and looked at the stock and looked at the numbers. So he notes that he has, or I believe it's a he, making assumptions here. They note that they have 1,200 shares at about $15.73 per share. As of Tuesday, Microvision is trading at $3.94. And between the time of posting, which was in March 12th, shares actually went up for a month to $21 and then just straight down ever since. So here's this guy saying, hey, buy these shares. If you don't believe me, do your research. And luckily, hopefully none of us bought shares because his research was false and he lost about $12 a share with 1,200 shares. That's kind of sketchy. The second one, it's talking about a cryptocurrency crash in February of 2021 that saw Bitcoin itself drop from $57,000 to $45,000. So, drop about 12,000. And he's saying, don't worry, this is, this happens. It'll go back up, kind of the feel. And since then, so in the year that's followed, anyways, in the last year, Bitcoin has kind of done this roller coaster up and down, up and down. It's done it twice, and it's currently trading at, I want to say like 50-ish thousand. So it's kind of back to break even. So in both of these cases, what does it actually take to do your own research? To actually determine for yourself whether you want to buy Microvision or Bitcoin or any other currency. So for starters, you need to be able to read and understand financial documents. I don't know if anybody's in here has ever done that. It's not easy. You need to learn jargon. There's a ton of jargon, especially when it comes to stock. There's a ton of jargon you have to learn. Deciding to actually purchase something, great. Now, what institution are you going to use? What trading options are you going to use? What fees do you have to worry about? Taxes. Everybody that bought GameStop, guess what? They've got short-term capital gains going through the roof, which is tied to their income. So whatever their income bracket is, that's how much they pay in short-term capital gains. If they hold on to it for a year and still sell it, now they've got to worry about long-term capital gains, which varies and maxes out at, I think, 20%. So you have to take that in consideration as well. Cryptocurrency, again, you have to learn the jargon. What the heck are they talking about when they're talking about forking and the difference between Bitcoin, Ethereum, Dogecoin, all those are the top three that I can think of, but there's hundreds more. If you go to the cryptocurrency subreddit and look at what they say to do your research, they talk about reading the white paper, sorry, which is a really technical computer document talking about how it was developed, how many or what its values are, what its goals are, who developed it, how it's going to be decentralized. You need to understand who are the players that are promoting this. For instance, Elon Musk heavily promoted Dogecoin for a while, and it went up. And then when he's like, I'm going to sell and get out of here, it dropped. So who's promoting it? Who's manipulating the market? You need to understand market cap and what that means, and what circulating supply means, and how that matters. You need to determine what exchange platform you're going to use, because there's hundreds out there. Do you need to use an electronic wallet? What does that mean? You have to know, was this coin externally audited? Or was it trustworthy? Or is it going to be a scam and I'm going to lose my money? And again, taxes. So all of that is what it takes to do your own research for stocks and cryptocurrency. And there's so much more. But that's the basics. So then what causes this fallacy that we understand what research is? One of the things is this idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It was first posited in 1999 by Dunning-Kruger. It's been argued back and forth ever since. Some research say it doesn't exist. It's just data noise. Some say it does exist. It's just wrongly applied or identified. And it's not so much about people being uninformed. It's more about people being misinformed. But what the general consensus of, if it does in fact exist, is basically people are typically overly optimistic when evaluating the quality of their performance on social and intellectual tasks. In particular, poor performers grossly overestimate their performances. So, in non-academic speak, people are overconfident in what they know how to do. The problem is that this has gone mainstream. As with many things, once it's gone mainstream, it's never coming back. So this was a summary of the explanation in 2008, basically saying people who either are misinformed about a topic or aren't know enough to get in trouble, overestimate what they're capable of doing. On the flip side, competent or self-aware people underestimate what they're capable of doing because they, realize, hey, I don't have all the information. Essentially, we're all armchair quarterbacks to one extent, to a certain extent, and we all tend to overestimate our abilities. So Dunning-Kruger, as I said, is people with low ability in a task often overestimate their own abilities. And the thing is that when this happens, they tend to suffer, a dual burden. So not only do they reach, erroneous conclusions, but they also make unfortunate choices. And this, as Dunning-Kruger said in 1999. When people are incompetent in the strategies they adopt to achieve success and satisfaction, they suffer dual burden. Not only do they reach erroneous conclusions and make unfortunate choices, but their incompetence robs them of the ability to realize it. So in academic speak, when you say somebody's incompetent, it doesn't mean they're stupid. Let's just clear that up. It does not mean that they're stupid. It just means that they don't have ability in a certain thing. And this is, as we saw with the subreddits, this can be seen in that admonition to do your own research, because people tend to think, oh, I want to buy this sock, I'm going to do a little research. We hop on Google, and since we all assume we're good Googlers, if that's a word, good at using Google, we hop on there and we find social media posts, we find YouTube videos, and we think, okay, yeah, I have a basic idea of what's going on here. Or think about those sports fans in the audience. How often do we think we know more than the coach or know more than the referee? How often do we think, oh, the player did that wrong. If I was out there, I'd totally make that pass or make that shot. And then compounding this is the fact that this overconfidence often causes us to realize that there's a problem. We often miss the fact that we're not capable of doing something. We go out and try and we think, oh, I did this. Awesome. I planned a mission to Mars. And then when you actually go to execute it, the whole thing falls apart and your spacecraft doesn't even take off the ground. And this is something we regularly see in the library as an aspect of information literacy. So, as you're aware, I'm a librarian. I teach classes on information literacy. And a lot of times, we'll get students in thinking, oh, I'm just going to Google this. I'm going to use Google for this assignment. I know we're supposed to use peer-reviewed sources, but I know I can find those on Google. I don't want to use the databases. And often that leads them to trouble. Also, students come in saying, well, I'm supposed to be here, but I know what I'm doing. I don't really need your help. Again, leads to trouble. In fact, somebody went through and did an analysis, and they looked at 53 studies of the Dunning-Kruger effect in libraries. They took these 53 studies and looked at the results and determined that 49 of the studies demonstrated that, at least in terms of information literacy, the Dunning-Kruger effect is a big problem. And they try to explain this in other studies. So like I said, it started in 1999. It was when it was first posited. And in later studies, they tried to pull the narrative away from people that don't know what they're doing, cause all these problems. Because the fact of the matter is, those of us, if we don't know how to do something, we're not going to say, oh, I know how to do that. If we don't know how to change a tire, we're not going to say I know how to do that. We're going to figure out how to change the tire. So what they're saying is it's more about the being misinformed. So think internet searching instead of planning a mission to Mars. Moving on from Dunning-Kruger, we get this notion of motivated reasoning and its sibling confirmation bias. So one of the definitions I found for motivated reasoning is it's our tendency to accept what we want to believe more readily and with less scrutiny than that which we don't want to believe. And then the same person, Maloney, defined confirmation bias as the tendency to search out, interpret, or even recall information in a way that reinforces pre-existing beliefs. So think of it as same sides of or opposite sides of the same coin. As we'll get into in a moment, this comic really accurately sums up both motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. And again, this is a really common occurrence. It's something we see all the time on social media or in classrooms. Somebody saying, okay, I've got both sides of the argument. Do I buy this stock? Do I not buy the stock? I'm going to search it. First thing that pops up, okay, I've got my answer. And the thing is, we're not the only ones that do this. News services, especially as they tend to become more biased in one way or the other, fall into this trap pretty regularly. And that's one of the reasons why, when we talk to students about doing research, about reading the news, a lot of times we tell them to use more than one source, because there's always going to be some sort of hidden bias in any source. And so to kind of negate that, you want to look at multiple angles. So what is motivated reasoning and confirmation bias? They both seek to minimize cognitive dissonance. So what cognitive dissonance is this idea of having thoughts that are inconsistent with what we believe. But they approach it in a little different ways. So motivated reasoning seeks to focus on what we already believe or want to believe, while confirmation bias looks at the information that only supports our position. So on the one hand, it looks for what we already know or already believe, while on the other hand, it looks for information that supports that. Motivated reasoning takes in new information as it supports us, while finding fault with data that conflicts, while confirmation bias just ignores that conflicting data to focus solely on supporting. So again, something we see all the time in the library. There's a really subtle differences in these, so I want to kind of demonstrate that. So I have a friend, he's fake. I have a fake friend, imaginary. He suggested to me one day I should buy GameStop stock. He says, I've got this source, this article that tells me it's going to triple in profit, and you're gonna make all the money in the world you want. And there's a part of me that's like, oh, that'd be awesome. If I could have like a couple $1 million, I'd be set for life. I could buy the car I want, maybe a slightly bigger house. So I hop onto Google and I search GameStop stock rising. And I find some articles, and some are from financial sources, so that's good. And I find some YouTube videos, and they all support my position, or my friend's position. I'm like, great, let's buy this stock. The problem is, especially in the way you phrase your search, right? Because Google has its algorithms, it works its magic, it gives you what you think you want. But the problem is the way I phrased my search, the GameStop, GME, I'm just gonna go with GME because GameStop stock is just too difficult. GME stock rising, like if I search that, I'm immediately falling into one of those biases. I'm immediately looking at that I kind of already lean towards buy, right? And by asking if the stock is rising, I'm indicating to Google that I'm leaning towards buy. So they're going to give me, all the articles that support that. And even if I did see some that disagreed with that position, chances are I just kind of ignored them because I want it to be true. I want to buy that stock and, have, millions of dollars and, be able to have that nice car and, the fancy house and all that. So the motivated reasoning comes into effect when I'm looking for when I search that and I'm already leaning towards buying. Confirmation bias comes into effect when I completely ignore all the sources saying not to buy. Even if there are any sources to buy, I look right past those because I'm already leaning towards believing. So that leads us to our last question. What is research? We say we do it all the time. Our students say they do it all the time. But what is research? Merriam-Webster defines it as careful or diligent search, studious inquiry or examination, the collecting of information about a particular topic, and the act of searching or investigating vigorously. I love that word, vigorously, because it's so opposite to what most of us, myself included, when I talk about, us doing our own research and all this, I'm talking about myself. It's the opposite of what we do. The Cambridge dictionary has what I think is kind of a better definition. They define it as a detailed study of a subject, especially in order to discover new information or reach a new understanding. So again, we tend to ignore that detailed part, right? We tend to just, like, oh, I'm going to learn this and I'm going to, look up a couple websites, read a couple articles, watch a couple of videos, and now I'm an expert. But this is what happens. Hey, I'm the facts. Did you want me? We only want the part of you that supports our opinion. Ha! You can't just take that part of me, silly. But they could and did. This is what happens when we do our own research without actually thinking about what we're doing. We cherry pick. We fall into those biases. We think we're more confident in our abilities than we really should. Come on. There we go. So this is the first part of the research process. This is the process that your average scientist or researcher, sociologist, psychologist, chemist, those that do a lot of research, this is the first part of what they do. And actually, we can adapt it for ourselves. So first off, they identify the problem, right? And they figure out what are we looking at? What is the choice that we want to make? And then second, they review the literature. And they don't just review the literature that supports their position, because remember, so far they've only identified the problem. They haven't really identified their position yet. They've identified their problem. And then they review the literature that both supports and argues against their position. And again, it's not something you can really do, on YouTube, Reddit, social media, talking to your cousin Joe. That's not reviewing the literature. That's, looking at multiple articles, multiple sources, moving beyond, just the New York Times or Fox or, CNN or any of those. It's really digging into what experts have to say, not experts, but actual experts. That's when they decide, okay, now I have this hypothesis. Now I have what I think my position is. And again, so far they've only identified, the problem. Should I buy stock? Should I not buy stock? Done some research. They've developed a hypothesis. Well, I don't think I should buy this stock. So you ask yourself, what is your position? What is your stance? And then they test that hypothesis. And they test it by asking questions. Well, we test it, and in our personal research, we test it by asking questions like, does my hypothesis make sense to me? Does my opinion, has it changed? Maybe I came in leaning towards buy, but I knew that was a problem and I wanted to double check it. Why did I change my opinion, or why didn't I change my opinion? Was there any one thing that affected my choice? Because if there's just one thing that affected my choice, why didn't all the other things change my mind? And this is that time where you start to ask those reflective questions that help you to realize, am I falling into the trap of, Dunning-Kruger or motivated reasoning or confirmation bias, or any of those other, 10,000 ways that make us, not realize we're on the right track. And only after that do researchers analyze their results, which is kind of a continuation for us of testing the hypothesis. It's where we review our responses to those questions. What changed my mind? Why didn't I change my mind? And this is where a lot of our internal arguing comes into play, especially when we've changed our mind. This is where we start to argue with ourselves and wonder, am I making the right choice? Am I making the wrong choice? Should I actually buy that stock, or am I smart to not buy the stock? Researchers then report their conclusions. Those are the papers that they write. And usually it's in, some form of research paper or study or something. And then they discuss with peers. And librarians, we call this scholarship being a conversation, right? So research papers, they get published, they have peers that review it. They discuss the findings among themselves, and it becomes a conversation of, well, I really liked your stance on this, but I disagree with it here. And for us, a lot of this happens, when we're talking with our friends and our family, right? Like my friend that said, hey, buy GameStop stock, GME stock. I come back to him saying, you know what? I did the research and I don't agree with that position. That's where we do this discuss with peers, is where we talk with others about what we found, because it is a conversation. It is discussing with each other about your stances and about how those stances change. And that dialogue, that discussion, that conversation is a critical part of the learning process for anything. The more you learn, the more you want to share and the more you want to discuss with others. And it's the same thing for somebody that's a nuclear scientist at Hanford or a psychologist at Stanford. Those guys, they're doing the same thing. They're discussing with their peers. And then, as always, repeat those steps as needed, because things change. For instance, I want to share a story about quite an interesting person. He was a polar researcher, a meteorologist, a geophysicist and geologist named Alfred Wegener. I hope I'm saying his name right. So Alfred Wegener in 1912 published his theory on continental drift and plate tectonics. And then he followed that by publishing a book in 1915 that became one of the most controversial books in science history, because at the time, people laughed at him, saying there's no such thing as continental drift or plate tectonics. That doesn't happen. And, they vehemently disagreed with him. There were arguments up and down. They called into question his character, his intelligence. They really beat this poor guy into the ground. And, everybody in the scientific community disagreed with him. It wasn't just like, him alone. There was, maybe 3 or 4 well-known people that are like, well, I think his ideas are sound. But for the most part, the scientific community just laughed this guy out of existence. He died in 1930, or in the 30s. I don't remember it was exactly 1930. He died in the 30s. And it wasn't until the 1950s, that scientists were like, oh, that Wegener guy? He was actually right. And it wasn't until the 1950s where his ideas came to become the scientific mainstream. Nowadays, if you say there's no such thing as continental drift or plate tectonics, you're left out of the building. But 110 years ago, it was the exact opposite. It was a scientist saying that, this is what's happening. Everybody else is saying, no, you're wrong. Get out of here. We don't want to talk to you. You're not a very intelligent person. You don't belong in the scientific community. And this is after he was one of the most prominent polar researchers, who is probably one of the most famous guys for studying how the polar ice caps work and how weather is affected by those. So he already had pretty good credentials. But in this area, people are like, no, not going to believe it. I disagree with you. You're not very intelligent. And the thing is that none of this would have happened if he hadn't jump-started that step 7 of discussing with his peers. Right? He published his research, he published his findings, and then he began that discussion, that conversation. So I want to wrap it up with this quote from Ethan Siegler. He's a journalist. He says, "The techniques that most of us use to navigate most of our decisions in life, gathering information, evaluating it based on what we know, and choosing a course of action, can lead to spectacular failures when it comes to a scientific matter." And honestly, it can lead to spectacular failures when it's not a scientific matter. When it's a matter of, doing your own research, how much have you allowed, the Dunning-Kruger effect to come into play? How motivated are you to find a specific answer or to support your specific position? because it's easy to be biased. Google isn't always the best. And research, however much we wish it wasn't, is a messy enterprise. It's like playing with pigs. I tell students all the time that research is like playing with pigs. You're going to get messy. You're going to get dirty. There's going to be some swearing. But in the end, it's what you need to do. We need to recognize that there are biases and this idea of cognitive dissonance influencing our choices. We need to understand that we can't rely on Google for everything, because Google has its own bias and its own algorithms that lead you in areas you probably didn't want to go. And then we need to remember that's a conversation. The research is going to be messy, and it requires varying levels of expertise to understand. Just because I'm a librarian with knowledge of various subjects does not make me an expert in all of them. And it's important that everyone else realizes that too. That just because we have expertise in maybe our career or expertise in some areas doesn't mean we have expertise in all areas. And thank you. We have some time for talks.
So we have time for a couple of questions if people have questions for people. Go on to Chris. No, we want it for the recording.
Oh, that's why I hesitated when I was about to say, I don't really need the microphone, but I'll take it. Hi, Ian. So loved your presentation. Thank you. And you got all my 102 students here, or they're in big trouble. So I'm curious about what you would say about primary research. So just for context, my technical writing students are required to do their own primary research, and I've been harping on them. They need to do direct observation and data collection. So could you speak to some examples of how we might be able to avoid some of these problems with bias and Dunning-Kruger and confirmation bias and those things by doing primary research instead of relying on the research of other people?
I think that's where scholarship as a conversation comes into play. Because your students, they're adding to the conversation. So while yes, they're doing their own research, you have to remember the context. Remember going back to that term that I talked about earlier, the context of the research. So yes, there might already be research done on the topic, and they're looking at how are they adding to it. So those students need to understand that they're not operating in a bubble, or not operating in a vacuum. And so while it isn't, primary research is always important. It's also looking at how is that adding to or disagreeing with what's already out there. Because that's going to be a critical piece of understanding, what their data is telling them.
Can I jump in on that just a bit? Okay, so as a I'm Courtney, I'm a historian, put on my history hat. So one of the big topics we always get thrown around, and like, why was the Civil War fought? And, I will go in and I'll say, it was about slavery. And then I get people pushing back saying, oh no, it was about states' rights. And so, I will say, you can, read the textbook, you can listen to me, but you can also go back and look at the various states' declarations of secession. Like, why do the leaders of South Carolina say they are leaving the Union? Why do the leaders of Texas say they're leaving the Union? And they're like, well, this was about slavery. It's, okay, there you go. So not necessarily just relying on what some guy on Google says, or relying on what I say, and I have my expert hat on, but I am not the end all be all of all of this. But to get to sort of that immediacy of primary research can get us closer to answering a question rather than having to go through the various levels of, well, this is what somebody said in the 1920s about it. This is what somebody said in the 1950s about it. Well, what did they actually say in the 1860s? And what I always tell my students is I want both. I want the primary sources and I want the secondary stuff, because each of those is a tool that gets us closer to the full truth. And if you are just listening to me, you're getting my biases.
Mhm.
And that's limiting. Not that
Definitely.
I have biases, of course, right? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I hope that was additional useful. Other questions? Yeah. Okay. Coming to Sean.
I got two parts and it's back to do your own research. So the first one is, I remember watching Mr. Rogers give an interview and he was asked, what will be the problem in the future? He said that too much information and not enough time to process it. In other words, evaluation was sacrificed for the 15 minutes of fame concept. At the time, it wasn't about the internet. It was over too many channels and children's programming of more quantity, but not quality. Is that something that we need to focus on? Is that of the quality of the work based off of what you talked about, the scientific process being utilized? And then second is, you had mentioned about the news. I mean, at one time that was the go-to place was television news, but then that all changed, I think, after what, the 60s and 70s. But so once upon a time, a problem is sources are not cited to ask for it. If you had to ask for it, you had to request a transcript. And to this date, now this is about, gosh, 2-3 years ago, it wasn't sent digitally still, or able to. It was sent through the mail.
Mhm.
So they would cite their sources and tell you this is where we got all the information. I don't know if it's been a while, but to ask for a transcript, I don't know if they digitally sent it to you, but why not have the news posts, all the news post their sources right after the report, publishing the report?
So to answer both your questions, the first one, there is an amazing book called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. Highly, highly recommend it. It talks about the way the internet has influenced our reading and the way we read and the way we consume information. And so to answer your part about Mr. Rogers, the internet has changed us. Without a doubt, the internet has caused us to not be as willing to dive into information. Think about the way you consume Facebook or your Google searches. It's looking at headlines. It's maybe reading 1 or 2 sentences. It's not even paying attention to who wrote it. It's not even paying attention to where it came from. And so I totally agree with quality over quantity. If you read 4 or 5 quality sources about a topic, you're going to get so much more information than if you read 50 or 60 lesser quality sources, because there's so much more effort put into something that's quality. And then to speak to your second question, I don't work in the news industry, so I can't give you a definitive answer, but I'm going to say it goes down to money. They don't really care that you read the research. They just care that you read the news. And so for them to put in that little bit of extra effort and, citing their sources, is it going to get extra clicks? Probably not. Is it going to get you to be, more influenced in your choices? Probably not. So let's just not do it.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience for coming, and thank you to Ian for presenting today. Take care, everybody.